Mrs. Evelyn Harper, a dignified black woman in her late 70s, enjoyed her daily walks through the park. Her silver hair, neatly tucked under a wide-brimmed hat, reflected the years of wisdom and resilience she had acquired. The park, with its blooming flowers and winding paths, was her sanctuary, a place where she could escape the noise of the world and reflect on the changes she had witnessed over the decades. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden light over the landscape as she made her way toward her favorite bench beneath a canopy of oak trees. The air was filled with the sweet scent of blooming flowers, and the gentle rustling of leaves provided a soothing backdrop to her thoughts. As she walked, Evelyn felt a deep sense of peace, savoring the tranquility that this place always brought her. But as she neared the bench, something unusual caught her attention. A group of teenage boys, all white and with shaved heads, stood near the bench, their loud voices and harsh laughter disrupting the peaceful atmosphere. Their presence was unsettling, and Evelyn felt a twinge of unease. She hesitated for a moment, considering whether to take a different path, but decided to continue, determined not to let fear dictate her actions. Evelyn continued her walk, the uneasy feeling growing stronger as she approached the bench. The boys noticed her and began to whisper among themselves, their eyes following her every move. She could feel their gazes on her, and her heart began to beat faster. She gripped her cane a little tighter, silently praying that this encounter would be just another fleeting moment in her day. As she reached the bench, the boys suddenly moved to block her path. They formed a semicircle around her, their expressions cold and menacing. The leader of the group, a tall boy with piercing blue eyes and a cruel smirk, stepped forward. "What are you doing here, old lady?" he sneered, his voice filled with contempt. The others laughed, their voices echoing through the quiet park, shattering the peace Evelyn had sought. Despite the fear that gripped her, Evelyn stood her ground. She had faced prejudice before, and she knew that showing fear would only embolden them. "I'm just here for my walk, like I am every day," she replied, her voice steady but soft. The leader's smirk widened, and he took another step closer, his presence imposing. "This park isn't for people like you," he said, his tone dripping with hostility. The other boys closed in tighter, their laughter now tinged with malice. The tension in the air was palpable as the boys encircled Evelyn, their hostility pressing down on her like a physical weight. Her mind raced, recalling the many times she had faced similar situations in her younger years. But this time she was older, more vulnerable, and the fear gnawed at her insides. Yet she refused to let them see her falter. She met the leader's gaze with a calm defiance that belied the storm brewing within her. The leader leaned in closer, his voice low and dangerous. "Are you lost, old lady?" he taunted, his breath hot against her skin. The boys laughed again, louder this time, their voices harsh and filled with malice. Evelyn's heart ached, not just from fear, but from the deep sadness of seeing such young faces twisted by hate. She looked into the eyes of each boy, hoping to find some glimmer of humanity, but all she saw was the reflection of their shared contempt. For a brief moment, Evelyn considered turning and walking away, but she knew that doing so would only embolden them further. Instead, she straightened her back, drawing on the inner strength that had carried her through so many trials in life. "I'm not lost," she replied quietly, her voice steady, "but it seems you might be." Her words hung in the air, met with a stunned silence from the boys. For a moment, the leader's bravado faltered, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. The leader's hesitation was brief, but it was enough to create a ripple of doubt among the group. His smirk faded, replaced by a look of anger, as he realized that Evelyn was not going to be easily intimidated. He stepped even closer, his posture aggressive. "You think you're smart, don't you?" he hissed, his voice laced with venom. The other boys fell silent, their eyes shifting nervously between Evelyn and their leader, sensing the tension that crackled in the air. Evelyn remained still, her gaze unwavering as she faced the boys' anger head-on. "I've lived long enough to know that hate gets you nowhere," she said, her voice calm but firm. Her words were met with a cold silence, the boys seemingly unsure of how to respond to her calm defiance. The leader clenched his fists, his knuckles turning white as he struggled to maintain control of the situation. He had expected fear, not this quiet strength. For a moment, Evelyn wondered if he might actually strike her. The thought sent a chill through her, but she refused to back down. She had faced worse in her life and had come through it stronger. "I'm just trying to walk through the park," she continued, her voice softening slightly. "Just like you." Her words seemed to hang in the air, creating a moment of stillness in the midst of the growing tension. The leader, caught off guard by her calm demeanor, hesitated, his anger momentarily tempered by confusion. The leader's moment of hesitation caused a ripple of uncertainty to spread through the group. The boys who had been so eager to follow his lead now seemed unsure of themselves. They glanced at each other, their bravado faltering as they sensed the shift in the mood. The youngest of the group, a boy with a slightly softer expression, stepped back slightly, his eyes darting between the leader and Evelyn. He seemed to be reconsidering his involvement, his uncertainty visible in the way he fidgeted with his hands. Discover the power of real-life experiences. Subscribe to our channel to hear inspiring stories that touch the heart and soul. Evelyn noticed the change, her sharp eyes catching the subtle signs of doubt among the boys. She saw an opportunity, however small, to reach them. "You don't have to do this," she said gently, her voice carrying a warmth that contrasted sharply with the coldness of the situation. "You're better than this." Her words were directed at all of them, but she focused her gaze on the youngest boy, hoping to reach him in particular. For a brief moment, the boy's eyes met hers, and she saw something shift in his expression, something that looked like regret or shame. But just as quickly as it appeared, it was gone, replaced by the hardened mask he had worn when they first confronted her. The leader, noticing the boy's hesitation, shot him a warning look, and the moment passed. The group seemed to regain their composure, their collective hostility returning, though now tinged with an undercurrent of uncertainty. As the tension reached a breaking point, Evelyn felt a wave of emotion rising within her. The fear, the sadness, and the weight of a lifetime of facing such moments began to overwhelm her. She had spent years standing strong against adversity, but at that moment, the weight of it all became too much. Tears welled up in her eyes, and despite her efforts to hold them back, they began to spill down her cheeks. The leader of the group, who had expected defiance or terror, was caught off guard by her tears. He had been prepared for a confrontation, for a battle of wills. But this display of vulnerability, was something he hadn't anticipated. "Are you crying?" he asked, his voice lacking the mockery it had held earlier. The other boys, too, seemed taken aback, their bravado fading as they watched the elderly woman cry. Evelyn didn't sob or wail. Her tears were quiet, a silent expression of the deep sorrow she felt. They were not tears of defeat, but of mourning. Mourning for the boys in front of her, for the paths they were choosing, and for the world that had brought them to this point. Her tears carried a weight that none of the boys could ignore, and in that moment, the power dynamic shifted. The boys who had started the encounter with such aggression now found themselves facing something they didn't know how to handle: humanity in its most vulnerable form. The boys who had been so confident and full of bravado just moments before now stood in the stunned silence as they watched Evelyn's tears fall. The leader, who had been at the forefront of the confrontation, seemed unsure of what to do next. His smirk had faded, replaced by a look of confusion and discomfort. He had expected a fight, not this raw display of emotion. The other boys exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier aggression dissipating in the face of Evelyn's quiet sorrow. The youngest boy, who had shown signs of doubt earlier, took a step back, his face showing a mix of guilt and uncertainty. He looked around at his friends, searching for some sort of guidance or reassurance, but found none. The group that had been so unified in their hostility now appeared fractured, each boy lost in his thoughts, grappling with the unexpected turn of events. The scene, once filled with tension and anger, was now heavy with an uncomfortable silence. Evelyn, still crying softly, looked at each of the boys in turn, her gaze filled with a mix of sadness and compassion. "You don't have to be like this," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "There's still time to change." Her words, spoken through her tears, seemed to hang in the air, touching each boy in a way that their leader's bravado never could. They stood there frozen, unsure of how to respond, their worldviews challenged by the simple humanity of the woman before them. The boys who had started the encounter with such certainty in their actions now found themselves grappling with a complex mix of emotions. The leader, who had been the driving force behind their aggression, seemed particularly shaken. He looked at Evelyn, his expression no longer one of disdain, but of uncertainty. Her tears had pierced through the walls he had built around himself, forcing him to confront the reality of his actions. The youngest boy, still standing slightly apart from the group, took another step back, his face showing a deep internal struggle. He had followed the others because he wanted to fit in, to belong, but now he was beginning to question whether this was the path he truly wanted to take. The sight of Evelyn's tears had stirred something within him, something that made him want to turn away from the hatred and anger that had brought them to this point. Evelyn, sensing the shift in the boy's demeanor, spoke again, her voice filled with quiet strength. "It's not too late," she said, her tears slowing but still glistening on her cheeks. "You can choose to be better." Her words, simple yet powerful, resonated with the boys in a way that nothing else had. They were faced with a choice, to continue down the path of hatred or to take a step back and reconsider. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of that decision. The leader of the group, who had been so sure of himself just moments before, now found himself at a crossroads. The tears of the elderly woman had shaken him to his core, forcing him to confront the ugliness of his actions. He had never been challenged in this way before, and it left him feeling vulnerable, a sensation he was entirely unaccustomed to. His eyes darted between his friends, searching for some sort of validation, but he found none. His friends, who had always looked to him for guidance, now seemed as lost as he felt. They were no longer the united front they had been at the start of the encounter. The youngest boy, in particular, was visibly uncomfortable, his eyes downcast as he shuffled his feet. The leader knew that if he continued down this path, he risked losing not just the respect of his friends, but also something deeper, his sense of self. Evelyn's quiet presence and her simple act of crying had unraveled the carefully constructed image he had built for himself. He realized that his hatred, his aggression, were nothing more than a shield to protect himself from his own insecurities. But now, faced with the humanity of the woman before him, that shield was crumbling. He felt exposed, unsure of what to do next, and for the first time, he questioned whether the path he was on was truly the right one. The tension that had once filled the air began to dissipate as the boys slowly backed away from Evelyn. The leader, who had been at the center of the confrontation, now looked at her with a mixture of confusion and regret. His bravado had melted away, leaving behind a young man who was grappling with emotions he didn't fully understand. He glanced at his friends, who were all watching him closely, waiting for him to make the next move. The youngest boy, who had been visibly uncomfortable throughout the encounter, was the first to turn away. He mumbled something under his breath, something that sounded like an apology, though it was too soft for Evelyn to hear clearly. Without waiting for the others, he began to walk away, his steps quickening as if he couldn't get away fast enough. The other boys hesitated, glancing between the leader and Evelyn, before slowly following suit. The leader stood still for a moment longer, his eyes locked on Evelyn's. There was something unspoken in the way he looked at her, a mixture of guilt and confusion that he couldn't quite put into words. Finally, he shook his head, as if trying to clear his thoughts, and turned to follow his friends. As he walked away, the park seemed quieter, the tension that had once filled the air replaced by an uneasy calm. Evelyn watched them go, her heart heavy but hopeful that her tears had planted a seed of change. As the boys disappeared from sight, Evelyn remained standing by the bench, her heart still heavy with the weight of what had just transpired. She had faced many challenges in her life, but this encounter had shaken her in a way she hadn't expected. The tears she had shed were not just for herself, but for the boys as well, for the paths they were on and the hate that had taken root in their young hearts. She prayed that her tears had reached them, that they would take this moment to reflect on their actions. Evelyn slowly sat down on the bench, her body feeling the exhaustion of the emotional turmoil she had just endured. She took a deep breath, the cool air filling her lungs, and closed her eyes for a moment, letting the stillness of the park wash over her. The birds were still chirping, the leaves rustling gently in the breeze, and for a moment, she allowed herself to simply be present in the peaceful surroundings. As she opened her eyes, she looked up at the sky, the soft glow of the setting sun casting a warm light over the park. She thought of the countless moments of courage and resilience that had brought her to this point in her life. She knew that this encounter was just one of many battles she had fought, and though it had left her feeling drained, it had also reaffirmed her belief in the power of compassion. She hoped that the boys would carry this moment with them, that it would spark a change in their hearts. As Evelyn sat on the bench, reflecting on the encounter, she realized that the tears she had shed were not a sign of weakness, but of strength. She had chosen to face the boys with compassion, even when they had shown her nothing but hatred. Her tears had been a powerful act of defiance, a way of showing them that there was another way to live, one that didn't involve hate or violence. She hoped that they had seen that, even if they couldn't fully understand it yet. She thought about the youngest boy, the one who had shown signs of doubt throughout the encounter. She could still see his face in her mind, the way he had hesitated, the way he had looked at her with something almost like regret. Evelyn prayed that he would remember this moment, that it would be the catalyst for him to choose a different path. She knew that change didn't happen overnight, but she believed in the power of small moments to spark big transformations. As she sat there, she felt a sense of peace wash over her. She had done what she could, and now it was up to the boys to decide what they would do next. Evelyn knew that she might never see the results of her actions, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that she had stood up to hate with love, and in doing so, she had stayed true to herself and her beliefs. She knew that the road ahead would still be difficult, but she was ready to face it with the same courage and compassion that had guided her through life. Evelyn's encounter with the boys had reaffirmed her belief in the power of compassion. She had always known that hate couldn't be fought with more hate, but this experience had shown her just how powerful a simple act of kindness could be. Her tears, though born of sadness, had touched the boys in a way that nothing else could have. They had been forced to confront their own humanity, to see her not as an enemy, but as a person with feelings and a history. As she sat on the bench watching the sun dip below the horizon, Evelyn felt a deep sense of peace. She knew that she had done the right thing, even if it had been difficult. She had faced those boys with courage, and in doing so, she had planted a seed of change in their hearts. She prayed that it would grow, that they would take this moment with them and remember it when they were faced with similar choices in the future. Evelyn's heart was full of hope as she stood up from the bench, ready to continue her walk home. She knew that there was still much work to be done, both in her own life and in the world around her. But she also knew that she wasn't alone in this journey. There were others out there who believed in the power of compassion, who were working every day to make the world a better place. And that knowledge gave her the strength to keep going, no matter what challenges lay ahead. As Evelyn began her walk home, the events of the day weighed heavily on her mind. The park, usually a place of peace and solitude, had been the site of an intense emotional encounter, one that she knew she would carry with her for a long time. The sun had set, and the sky was now a deep shade of blue with stars beginning to twinkle above. The cool evening air was refreshing, and Evelyn took a deep breath, allowing it to fill her lungs and clear her mind. The path home was familiar, lined with trees and softly lit by street lamps. Evelyn walked slowly, her cane tapping rhythmically against the pavement. She thought about the boys, especially the leader and the youngest one. She wondered what they were thinking now, if they were reflecting on what had happened, or if they had already brushed it off and moved on. She hoped that her tears had made an impact, that they had seen something in her that would stay with them. As she walked, Evelyn found herself feeling more at peace. The confrontation had been difficult, but she had faced it with dignity and compassion. She knew that she had done all she could, and now it was out of her hands. The stars above seemed to twinkle more brightly as she neared her home, and she felt a renewed sense of hope. The world was still full of challenges, but it was also full of beauty, and Evelyn was determined to focus on that as she continued her journey through life. Discover the power of real-life experiences. Subscribe to our channel to hear inspiring stories that touch the heart and soul. When Evelyn finally arrived home, she was greeted by the warmth and familiarity of her small, cozy house. The scent of lavender from the potpourri on her table filled the air, and the soft glow of the lamp in the living room cast a comforting light. She set her cane by the door and made her way to the kitchen, where she prepared herself a cup of chamomile tea. The events of the day had left her feeling drained, and she looked forward to a quiet evening to unwind and reflect. As she sipped her tea, Evelyn sat in her favorite armchair by the window, gazing out at the stars. The night was peaceful, a stark contrast to the tension she had felt earlier in the park. She let the warmth of the tea soothe her, feeling the knots of stress in her body slowly begin to unravel. The soft ticking of the clock on the wall was the only sound in the room, creating a sense of calm and tranquility that she desperately needed. Evelyn's thoughts drifted back to the boys, and she found herself hoping once again that her tears had touched them in some way. She knew that change didn't happen overnight, but she believed that the seeds of compassion she had planted might one day grow. She closed her eyes, offering a silent prayer for the boys, for herself, and for the world. And as she sat there, the events of the day slowly began to fade into the background, leaving her with a deep sense of peace and acceptance. Just as Evelyn was beginning to relax, there was a soft knock at her door. Startled, she set her teacup down and made her way to the entrance, wondering who could be visiting at this hour. When she opened the door, she was greeted by the familiar face of her neighbor, Mrs. Green, a kind woman in her 60s with a warm smile and a caring heart. "Evelyn, I hope I'm not disturbing you," Mrs. Green said, her voice filled with concern. "I just wanted to check on you." Evelyn's heart warmed at the sight of her friend, and she invited Mrs. Green inside. "You're always welcome here," she replied, her voice soft with gratitude. The two women sat together in the living room, and Mrs. Green quickly noticed the lingering sadness in Evelyn's eyes. "Is everything all right?" she asked gently, placing a comforting hand on Evelyn's arm. "You seem a bit down." Evelyn hesitated for a moment before opening up about the events in the park. As she recounted the confrontation with the boys, Evelyn felt a weight lifting off her shoulders. Mrs. Green listened intently, her expression growing more serious with each detail. When Evelyn finished, Mrs. Green sighed deeply, her eyes filled with empathy. "I'm so sorry you had to go through that," she said, her voice heavy with emotion. "But I'm proud of you for how you handled it. You showed those boys something they'll never forget." Evelyn nodded, feeling comforted by her friend's words. As the evening wore on, Evelyn and Mrs. Green continued to talk, their conversation shifting from the events of the day to lighter topics. They reminisced about old times, shared stories of their families, and laughed at memories of their younger days. The warmth and familiarity of their friendship brought Evelyn a sense of comfort that she hadn't realized she needed. Mrs. Green had always been a steady presence in her life, and tonight, that presence was more valuable than ever. Mrs. Green, sensing that Evelyn needed more than just conversation, suggested they take a moment to pray together. Evelyn agreed, and the two women bowed their heads, holding hands as they offered their prayers for peace, strength, and understanding. The act of praying together, of sharing their faith, brought a deep sense of connection and solace to both women. They prayed not only for themselves but also for the boys, hoping that they would find their way to a better path. When the prayer was over, Evelyn felt a renewed sense of strength. The fear and sadness she had felt earlier in the day were still there, but they were now tempered by the love and support of her friend. She knew that she wasn't alone, that there were people in her life who cared for her deeply. The bond of friendship had given her the strength to face whatever challenges might come her way. And as Mrs. Green prepared to leave, Evelyn thanked her, knowing that their time together had been a healing balm for her soul. After Mrs. Green left, Evelyn prepared for bed, feeling more at peace than she had earlier in the evening. She changed into her nightgown and took a moment to brush her hair, the familiar routine bringing her a sense of calm. As she stood in front of the mirror, she looked at her reflection, her eyes tracing the lines and wrinkles that told the story of her life. She saw strength in those lines, a testament to the resilience that had carried her through so many trials. Evelyn turned down the covers of her bed and slipped under the blankets, the softness and warmth enveloping her in comfort. She reached over to her bedside table and picked up her favorite book, one that she had read countless times before. The familiar words brought her a sense of peace, and she allowed herself to get lost in the story, letting it carry her away from the worries of the day. The gentle sound of the pages turning was the only noise in the room, and soon Evelyn felt her eyes growing heavy. As she closed the book and set it aside, Evelyn offered a final prayer for the night, thanking God for the strength to face the challenges of the day and for the love and support of her friends. She knew that the world could be a difficult place, But she also knew that she had the strength to face whatever came her way. With a deep breath, she closed her eyes, letting the peace of the night wash over her. And as she drifted off to sleep, she felt a deep sense of gratitude for the life she had lived. The next morning, Evelyn awoke to the soft light of dawn filtering through her curtains. The events of the previous day were still fresh in her mind, but they no longer felt as heavy. She stretched and got out of bed, feeling a sense of renewal as she prepared to face the day. The birds outside her window were already singing, their cheerful melodies a reminder that life went on, no matter what challenges she faced. Evelyn made her way to the kitchen, where she brewed herself a cup of coffee. As she sat at the table, sipping the warm, comforting drink, she took a moment to reflect on the encounter with the boys. She thought about the tears she had shed, the emotions that had surfaced so unexpectedly, and the way the boys had reacted. She knew that she might never see them again, but she hoped that the experience had left a lasting impression on them. Discover the power of real-life experiences. Subscribe to our channel to hear inspiring stories that touch the heart and soul. As the sun rose higher in the sky, filling her kitchen with golden light, Evelyn felt a deep sense of peace. She knew that the world was far from perfect, but she also knew that there was goodness in it, and that goodness could be found in even the most unexpected places. She was determined to carry that belief with her as she went about her day, holding on to the hope that her actions, however small, could make a difference in the world. After finishing her coffee, Evelyn decided to visit her church, a place that had always brought her comfort and peace. She dressed in her Sunday best, even though it was only a weekday, and made her way to the small white chapel at the end of her street. The church was quiet this time of day, with only a few people inside, praying or lighting candles. The air was filled with the scent of incense, and the soft light from the stained glass windows created a serene atmosphere. Evelyn knelt at the altar, bowing her head in prayer. She prayed for the boys, asking God to guide them and help them find their way to a better path. She prayed for strength and courage to continue facing the challenges of life with grace and dignity. And she prayed for the world, for an end to the hatred and division that seemed to be growing every day. Her prayers were simple but heartfelt, each word filled with the wisdom and love of a lifetime of faith. When she finished praying, Evelyn lit a candle, watching as the small flame flickered and danced in the dim light of the church. She sat in the pew for a while longer, simply enjoying the peace and quiet of the chapel. The events of the previous day seemed distant now, softened by the gentle light of the church and the comfort of her faith. She knew that there would be more challenges ahead, but she felt ready to face them, armed with the strength of her beliefs and the support of her community. As Evelyn was leaving the church, she noticed a young man sitting on the steps outside. He was slouched over, his head in his hands, and his body language spoke of deep distress. Evelyn recognized him immediately. It was the youngest boy from the park, the one who had shown signs of doubt during the confrontation. Her heart went out to him, and she hesitated for a moment before walking over to where he sat. "Are you all right, son?" she asked gently, her voice filled with concern. The boy looked up, his eyes red and swollen, as if he had been crying. He seemed surprised to see her, and for a moment he just stared at her, unsure of what to say. Evelyn could see the pain in his eyes, and she knew that he was struggling with something deep inside. She sat down beside him, giving him the space to speak if he wanted to. The boy didn't say anything at first, but after a few moments he began to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. He told her that he had been thinking about what had happened in the park, about the things he had said and done. He confessed that he felt ashamed of himself, that he didn't know why he had gone along with the others. Evelyn listened patiently, her heart aching for him. She could see that he was truly remorseful, and she knew that this was a moment of great significance for him. Evelyn listened intently as the boy continued to speak, his words coming out in a rush, as if he had been holding them in for too long. He told her about his life, about the anger and frustration he felt, and how he had fallen in with the wrong crowd because he didn't know where else to turn. He spoke of his father, who had left when he was young, and his mother, who was struggling to make ends meet. Evelyn's heart ached for him as she realized just how lost he felt. When the boy finished speaking, Evelyn reached out and placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "You're not alone," she said softly. "We all make mistakes, But what matters is what we do after. You have the power to change your life, to choose a different path. The boy looked at her, his eyes filled with tears, and for the first time Evelyn saw a glimmer of hope in his expression. He nodded slowly, as if her words were starting to sink in. Evelyn continued to speak to him, offering words of encouragement and advice. She told him about the importance of finding people who would lift him up, not drag him down. She spoke of the strength that could be found in faith and community, and how there were always people willing to help if he just reached out. The boy listened intently, soaking in her words like a sponge. By the time they finished talking, Evelyn could see that he was starting to believe that change was possible. As their conversation came to an end, the boy wiped away his tears and looked at Evelyn with a newfound sense of determination. "Thank you," he said, his voice filled with sincerity. "I don't know what I would have done if I hadn't run into you today." Evelyn smiled warmly at him, her heart filled with pride. She could see that this was a turning point for him, and she was grateful to have been a part of it. She offered to help him find resources in the community, places where he could get the support he needed to turn his life around. The boy agreed, and they exchanged phone numbers so that they could stay in touch. Evelyn promised to check in on him regularly, to make sure he was staying on the right path. The boy thanked her again, and as he walked away, Evelyn could see a new light in his eyes, a sense of hope that hadn't been there before. As Evelyn watched him go, she felt a deep sense of fulfillment. She knew that this encounter was no coincidence, that it was part of a greater plan. The events of the previous day had been difficult, but they had led to this moment, a moment of healing and transformation. Evelyn knew that the road ahead would still be challenging for the boy, but she was confident that he had the strength to overcome whatever obstacles he might face, and she would be there to support him every step of the way. In the days that followed, Evelyn found herself reflecting on the power of compassion and the importance of reaching out to those in need. She shared her experience with Mrs. Green, who was deeply moved by the story of the boy's transformation. The two women decided that they wanted to do more to help others in the community who might be struggling. They began organizing weekly meetings at the church, where people could come to talk, share their stories, and offer support to one another. The meetings quickly grew in popularity, attracting people from all walks of life. Some came to share their struggles, while others came to offer guidance and encouragement. Evelyn and Mrs. Green were there every week, offering a listening ear and a warm smile to anyone who needed it. The meetings became a source of strength and hope for many, and the sense of community that they fostered was palpable. Evelyn found great joy in these gatherings, knowing that she was making a difference in the lives of others. The encounter with the boys in the park had been a catalyst for change, not just for them, but for the entire community. It had shown her the power of compassion and the ripple effect that a single act of kindness could have. As she continued her work, Evelyn felt a deep sense of purpose, knowing that she was helping to build a brighter future for those around her. As the weeks turned into months, the impact of Evelyn and Mrs. Green's efforts began to be felt throughout the community. The weekly meetings at the church had become a cornerstone of support for many, and the bonds that were formed there were strong and enduring. People who had once felt isolated and alone now had a place where they belonged, a community that cared for them and lifted them up. The sense of unity and compassion that had been fostered was tangible, and it spread throughout the town like a beacon of hope. The young boy from the park, who had been at the center of the transformation, was a regular attendee at the meetings. He had taken Evelyn's advice to heart and was working hard to turn his life around. He had distanced himself from the negative influences in his life and was focusing on building a brighter future. He had even begun to mentor other young people in the community, sharing his story and encouraging them to make better choices. Evelyn watched with pride as the boy grew into a strong and compassionate young man. His transformation was a testament to the power of compassion and the strength of the human spirit. The community, once divided by hatred and fear, had been brought together by a shared commitment to kindness and understanding. And while there were still challenges to be faced, the foundation that had been built was strong, and Evelyn knew that it would endure. One day, several months after the encounter in the park, Evelyn was sitting on her favorite bench when she noticed a group of young men approaching. As they got closer, She realized with a start that it was the same group of boys who had confronted her that day, including the leader. But something was different about them now. Their expressions were no longer filled with anger and hostility. Instead, they looked nervous, almost apologetic. The leader of the group stepped forward, his eyes meeting Evelyn's. "Mrs. Harper," he began, his voice hesitant, "we came to apologize." Evelyn was taken aback, but she quickly regained her composure. She could see that the boys were sincere, and she felt a surge of compassion for them. She nodded for him to continue, and the leader went on to explain that the encounter in the park had been a turning point for all of them. He told her how they had spent months reflecting on their actions, and how they had realized the harm they had caused. They had been working to change their ways, to become better people, and they wanted to make amends for what they had done. The other boys nodded in agreement, their expressions filled with remorse. Evelyn listened quietly, her heart swelling with pride and hope. She could see that these young men had come a long way, and she was grateful for the opportunity to witness their transformation. When the leader finished speaking, there was a moment of silence as Evelyn took in his words. She could see the sincerity in his eyes, and she knew that this was a moment of great significance for all of them. "Thank you for your apology," she said softly, her voice filled with warmth. "It takes a lot of courage to admit when you're wrong, and I'm proud of you for making that choice." The boys seemed relieved, and their faces lit up with gratitude. Evelyn continued, her voice gentle but firm. "Forgiveness is a powerful thing, but it's not just about saying sorry. It's about changing your actions and making better choices moving forward. I believe that you have the strength to do that." The boys nodded, taking her words to heart. They knew that this was not the end of their journey, but the beginning of a new chapter in their lives, one where they could be proud of the people they were becoming. As they stood there, Evelyn reached out and took the leader's hand in hers. "I forgive you," she said, her eyes filled with compassion. "But more importantly, I want you to forgive yourselves and to use this experience to become better people." The leader's eyes filled with tears and he nodded, his voice choked with emotion as he thanked her. The other boys followed suit, each one expressing their gratitude and their commitment to change. It was a moment of healing and reconciliation, one that would stay with them all for the rest of their lives. The boys, having made amends with Evelyn, began a new chapter in their lives. They became active members of the community, participating in the weekly meetings at the church and volunteering their time to help others. They were no longer the angry, misguided youths who had confronted Evelyn in the park. They were young men who had learned from their mistakes, who were committed to making a positive impact in the world. Evelyn watched their transformation with a deep sense of pride and fulfillment. She had always believed in the power of compassion, and now she had seen it firsthand. These boys, who had once been lost in a sea of anger and hatred, had found their way to a better path. They had learned that kindness and understanding were far more powerful than fear and aggression, and they were determined to live their lives according to those principles. The community, too, had been transformed. The bonds that had been formed through the weekly meetings and acts of service were strong and enduring. People from all walks of life came together to support one another, to lift each other up in times of need. The sense of unity and compassion that had been fostered was a beacon of hope for all who lived there. And Evelyn, who had been at the heart of it all, knew that this was just the beginning of something truly beautiful. As the months passed, Evelyn continued to be a guiding force in the community. Her story and the story of the boys' transformation became a source of inspiration for many. People from other towns began to hear about what was happening, and they came to learn from Evelyn and Mrs. Green to see how they could bring the same sense of unity and compassion to their own communities. Evelyn's legacy was one of love, understanding, and the belief that everyone had the power to change. The young boy from the park, who had been the first to reach out to Evelyn, had become a leader in his own right. He had taken the lessons he had learned from her and was now mentoring others, helping them to find their way to a better path. Evelyn watched with pride as he grew into a strong, compassionate young man, someone who would continue to spread the message of kindness and understanding wherever he went. Evelyn knew that she wouldn't be around forever, but she took comfort in the knowledge that her legacy would live on through the people she had touched. The community she had helped to build was strong and resilient, and she knew that it would continue to thrive long after she was gone. As she looked around at the people she had come to love, she felt a deep sense of peace. She had lived a full life, one filled with challenges and triumphs, and she was ready for whatever came next. As Evelyn sat on her favorite bench in the park, watching the sun set over the horizon, she felt a deep sense of contentment. The events of the past months had been a testament to the power of compassion, of the ability to forgive and to change. The boys who had once confronted her with hatred had become her friends, their lives transformed by the simple act of kindness. The community, once divided, was now united in its commitment to love and understanding. Evelyn knew that there would always be challenges in life, but she also knew that there was always hope. She had seen the darkness, but she had also seen the light, and she believed that the light would always prevail. As she watched the sky turn from gold to deep blue, she felt a sense of peace wash over her. The world was far from perfect, but it was filled with beauty, and Evelyn was determined to focus on that as she continued her journey. The future was bright, not just for Evelyn, but for the community she had helped to build. The seeds of compassion she had planted had taken root, and they were growing into something truly beautiful. As she stood up from the bench and began her walk home, Evelyn knew that she was leaving behind a legacy of love and understanding, one that would continue to inspire and uplift others for generations to come. And that, she knew, was the greatest gift she could give.